obviously part of this story. Nolan King joins us right now. Again, MMA Junkie USA Today. He's on the Folsom Lake Honda hotline. Folsom Lake Honda, your one-stop Honda shop. Nolan, let me first ask you, and thanks for joining us, my man. Appreciate the time as always. How did Jones look to you on the scale this morning as he moves up to heavyweight?
Yeah, I mean, I thought he looked pretty good, Nick. I appreciate you having me on again. But, I thought there was much ado made, obviously, about Jones's transition, not only in his skills, but also in his physique as he moved up to heavyweight over the past 3 years. And there were some images that came out from the UFC studio shoot earlier this week where people were kind of criticizing him, saying he looked like he was carrying a lot of extra unnecessary weight. But when he got on the scales this morning, I thought he looked pretty svelte. I thought he looked like he had, put on some good weight as well, some muscle, like his upper body strength looked bigger. So I'm not really sure what people were expecting. Like, I said to somebody today, like, I almost feel like anything short of Brock Lesnar stepping up on those scales, somebody would have criticized. So for me, I think he looked good. I think with heavyweight, obviously, it's a little tougher to tell how somebody's going to look skills-wise or cardio-wise when they get in there. We've seen physiques like Mark Hunt and Roy Nelson have success at heavyweight. So it's not always a visual thing. You got to see how the guy looks when he starts moving. And to me, I thought Jon filled out his frame pretty well.
And whether or not he's in the best shape or not, you would think that when we talk about basketball or baseball, whatever the case might be, the guy gets injured, they come back, and we talk about the rust factor. There's going to be some rust there when he steps back in the octagon for the first time in 3 years, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, it's the toughest thing to try to anticipate. I have friends asking me all the time about placing bets and, who's going to win, how's he going to look. And I genuinely think the biggest and most unpredictable and tangible when it comes to fighting is when you have guys with these long layoffs, because sometimes we've seen guys come in and they shock everyone and they look better than ever. But then you also see sometimes where they come in and you're like, man, they aged. They were out for 2-3 years and they look like they've been out of here for 10 years. So it's very difficult to predict. It's something that unless you're in the gym or one of their training partners or whatever, it's really a difficult thing to predict. And 3 years is a long time. Then you throw in the weight shift as well. I think there's going to be a lot of, things that we can't predict. We can speculate as much as we want right now of what we think is going to happen, but nobody really knows except Jon Jones and his guys until he gets in there on Saturday.
Nolan King with us here on Cattles and Rami, Sactown Sports. Nolan, you mentioned the conditioning. The biggest kind of physical question that you have, or just the biggest question you have about this move up for Jon?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's going to be speed. I think heavyweight, obviously, if you have some speed and you have some cardio, it goes a long way. He's always had the technique. I think he could theoretically run laps around that division in the technique department. But how does his cardio and how does his speed? How much of an advantage is it going against a guy like Ciryl Gane, who's not a typical heavyweight? I mean, he is a good technical fighter. He's got some of the speed and the speed and the cardio is usually something that plays up to his strengths. Jon's not going in there against a traditional heavyweight who might be slower, who might gas, who might not necessarily have that gas tank. So I think it's an interesting matchup as well. It's not necessarily representative of the entire division. So I guess really my biggest question is, how does his skills translate to the 265-pound division?
Because there's a supreme confidence that Jon Jones has. And I think anybody who dominates any sport the way that he did, that they walk around with, does he still have that air about him? Do you feel like he's in the right mental place to return to the sport?
I do. It's funny. For better or worse, I don't think Jon Jones has ever changed much in terms of his mentality. And I think people can criticize everything that he's done outside of the cage and as a person instead of an athlete. But as an athlete, it's very hard to criticize him. I think maybe even some of the faults that he has as a person is something that has helped him succeed as an athlete. He has unwavering belief in himself. He's willing to take on challenges. Regardless of what anybody says, Jon Jones sitting out the last couple of years, it was nothing to do with him not wanting to fight. It was not wanting to fight in circumstances that he didn't feel like he was getting what he deserved. So I think he's coming into this with a tremendous headspace. He's been ready to go, from my understanding, since like October or November of last year. It's just a matter of trying to figure out who he was going to fight. And when Francis Ngannou was not the one that was going to be across the cage from him, he took the next best guy. And I mean, to be honest with you, there's a lot less of a reward for Jon Jones, I think, going in there against a guy like Ciryl Gane, when the risk is maybe not as big either, but it's still pretty significant. So for me, I think Jon's in a good mental headspace. I think he's just the same guy that we've seen. And I think, honestly, there might be a little bit even more of a chip on his shoulder to prove to people that he can do it in a different weight class.
Nolan King with us from MMA Junkie USA Today. Nolan, I know that Jon over the last week or so has talked about his last couple of fights at light heavyweight. They weren't great. They were pedestrian when you compare them to his prior fights. He said that it was a case of him not really being up for those fights, that these guys were pretty much no names to him, and he couldn't really get himself going. Do you buy into that? Do you buy into the idea that the last couple of fights we saw from Jon going back 3 years ago wasn't him kind of burning out and fading? It was more about him not being motivated?
I think it's kind of a half truth. I think that there's certain fights, the Gustafsson fight that was maybe whatever 3 or 4 fights ago. I think that one he was motivated for. I could see where like Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes maybe is a little bit more difficult for a guy to get off the couch to try to prepare for. But really what the bottom line is the fact that Jon has had kind of a problem focusing on training throughout his career. He's been for as much as he has faults outside the cage, he has been honest when it's come to his training regimen for certain fights, saying like the first Gustafsson fight, there were times where he would wake up and be hungover and not even train and blah, blah, blah. So for me, I think he's always been a guy that has needed a little bit extra motivation to even make it to a regular training camp, which goes to show you like how good could this guy have been if he had taken it as seriously as some of the other guys. So for me, I do believe it. But again, does that mean that things were different this time around? I'm not sure. I guess Jon's really the only one that can know that. And again, it's hard to argue with a recipe that's been so successful. Even though he's had those close fights, he's won. So maybe if his motivation is 50% greater, that's all he'll need in order to move up to heavyweight and beat a guy like Ciryl Gane.
Nolan, I just got a couple more for you. Looking at the opponent now, we haven't talked a lot about Ciryl Gane. Dangerous guy. When Jon's watching film, what do you think concerns him the most about Ciryl Gane's game?
Well, it has to be a striking, I would assume. Gane coming from a kickboxing background, I think there's a lot of things that he does similar to Jon in certain ways when it comes to the striking. But I think Jon, and he's even indicated this, he thinks he has a very big advantage in the wrestling department. So for me, that makes me think that he, at least when he's not calling out Ciryl's striking that often or in interviews, that makes me think he respects Ciryl in that department. That's been Ciryl's bread and butter. I know Ciryl's gotten some submissions in MMA that have, at the time, were surprising to people, that he was able to come in and kind of start submitting people. But I think, Jon's going to be careful with the striking. I think Ciryl's like I said, for the heavyweight division, Ciryl's cardio is pretty good. He's got power. He's a guy that's pretty calm while he's in there. He's got good composure. So I think Jon can't underestimate him in the striking department. But like I said, I don't think he is either, which is a big feather in his cap coming in here with the right mental respect that he has for Ciryl Gane.
I got one more for you. I'm trying to figure out which one I want to ask you. Do I want to ask you about Shevchenko? No, because she's probably going to beat Grasso. Do I want to ask you about the main event? Who's going to win? No, because I know guys don't love doing that. So I'm going to ask you about Bo Nickel. This dude is hyped like crazy. A lot of people excited for his UFC debut tomorrow night. Tell the people who are going to be watching this event about Bo Nickel and why there's so much excitement around this guy.
Yeah, Bo Nickel is maybe the greatest MMA prospect of all time in terms of a guy that's coming into the UFC with the most amount of buzz. I mean, you can look at the history of the sport. Ronda Rousey came in, but she had already kind of established herself as a really talented female fighter when the women weren't in the UFC. So that was very different. But Bo Nickel is a former, NCAA All-American at Penn State. He's a former Dan Hodge Trophy winner, and he's coming into MMA with just 18 months of experience and 3 pro fights that have lasted, I think, somewhere around 3 minutes in total against guys that were regional champions in MMA, and he's knocking them out. I mean, he's got knockout power. He's perfected his hands. He's been training. He's been a part of many MMA fighters' camps down at American Top Team for the past couple of years as a wrestling training partner. Now he's doing it for himself. So he's a guy, a lot of times when we see wrestlers come into MMA, they're over the hill. They're past their prime and they're looking for something else. He's coming in the prime of his career. He's one of the best wrestlers on planet Earth in a division that needs prospects, and is showing some things that we don't typically see from wrestlers. He's showing hands, knockout power, ability to use the microphone. I think he's really the real deal, and the UFC really has a star in their hands if things continue to keep going this way.
Nolan, you're the best, man. Appreciate you as always. Let's do it again soon and have fun tomorrow night.
Absolutely. You too. Thanks, man.
Thanks, buddy. There goes Nolan King, MMA Junkie USA Today on the Folsom Lake Honda Hotline. Folsom Lake Honda, your one-stop Honda shop, UFC 285.